Hello, thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King, published in 1987, and this is of course the second book in the Dark Tower series. I made a previous video for The Gunslinger, which is the first book, and I also talked about the movie The Dark Tower, which admittedly I probably should have waited to watch that. But anyway, that is in my previous video. And in that video, I talk about how I was worried because the book starts out with a map of a fictional world. And whenever I see things like that, I'm always worried that it's going to be the fantasy will be too intense for me because I just don't enjoy fantasy. And so I want to give another update as far as the fantasy element here in this book and say that it is incredibly light. And again, it is sci-fi, if anything, but even the sci-fi aspect is also light. Because there's books like Dune, right, that are sci-fi, and yet it's like so intense sci-fi that it's basically fantasy in many ways, in my opinion. But yeah, this one you do not need to worry about that. So if you are like me and do not like fantasy, The Drawing of the Three, most of it takes place in our world, just at different time periods. So yeah, I was all on board with that. And then also it is very character heavy, which, to be fair, you could say that about The Gunslinger as well. But yeah, this one I almost feel was even more character heavy, which again, I am all on board with because I tend to prefer character heavy books opposed to plot heavy books. And also one of the reasons I love Stephen King is because his character work is always so incredible. So I loved that about this one. And then this book is also very funny. And this is a light spoiler, you could say. Here, Roland enters into different time periods of our world, and kind of like how we saw in the movie, his reaction to it can be funny. But also there's just some things that happen that gave me a good chuckle, and so it was funnier than I expected. And then also I wanted to say that there is a character with dissociative identity disorder, but in the book it is said that they have schizophrenia. And I talked about schizophrenia in depth in my video for A Beautiful Mind. So based on what I learned making that video, the character here does not have schizophrenia. Again, they have dissociative identity disorder. But even as far as that disorder is concerned, I wouldn't say this is necessarily an accurate portrayal of it. And yet it is also, as we'll get into, there's some wiggle room as far as accuracy is concerned due to the reasons behind it. But yeah, essentially, they call it schizophrenia, and this is in no way schizophrenia. So that doesn't ruin the book for me, for him, getting those details wrong. But I guess I just wanted to shamelessly plug my video for A Beautiful Mind because I covered so many fascinating topics in that video, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. So go ahead and check it out if you have not already. But also, speaking of past videos, he references the movie The Shining in this book, which I thought was funny because he's referencing his own work, but also kind of not, because it is specific to the movie, which he infamously hated. Yet he is still talking about how it was shot, so, clearly it made an impression on him and it stuck with him. And yeah, so I thought that was interesting. But then also this was published the same year as Misery, which I recently reread for Patreon. And there were a few things in this that were reminding me of Misery. And to be fair, they're pretty subtle, you could say. For example, there's a character who talks about being a do-be and a don't-be, and that is referenced in Misery. But also there is a character who is unwell and she refers to men she doesn't like as Mr. Man, which is also in Misery. We have a character in a wheelchair, which is a broad comparison, but still. And then also Misery, the book, it's not as funny as the movie Misery, I wouldn't say, and yet there is some humor in that book. And then also, like I said, The Drawing of the Three was very funny. And Stephen King is good at writing humor, but obviously some of his books have more of it than others. So yeah, those are my spoiler-free thoughts, and all of that to say I really enjoyed this book. I would highly recommend it, especially, if you've read The Gunslinger, continue on. I liked this one better than the first book, I would say. So yeah, those are my spoiler-free thoughts, and now let's get into the details of the plot. So this book kicks off right away with Roland getting some of his fingers eaten by these huge lobster monsters, which he aptly refers to as lobstrosities, because he is on a beach by the way. So this picks up a number of hours after the first book ends. So he has met with the man in black, and the man in black had read his fortune with tarot cards. I don't know if I mentioned that in my previous video, but in this movie, we see these fortunes, like these cards, we see it all come to pass as we read this book. And so, yeah, he ends up on a beach. These huge lobstrosities attack him, and then his wounds get infected, and he just gets weaker and weaker and sicker because of this. But he does eventually come upon doors that lead him to other worlds. And by the way, in my previous video, I was speculating like what the gunslinger's world is. And I do think at this point that it is... And maybe, I don't think they actually said, let me know if I just missed it, but I don't think it's ever been explicitly said what his world is, but it comes across as just our world in the future, right? I think that's fair to say. But then also there is part of me that wonders if it is the afterlife, because I feel like there's enough evidence to support that. But then it could also just be a parallel universe of our world. But yeah, it could still be our world just in the distant future. I guess that one makes the most sense. But yeah, anyway. So when he goes through the first door, his Ka, which is his soul, his consciousness. So while Ka is kind of like what he refers to as his consciousness, at the same time, it does have a greater meaning than that as well, like fate and destiny. So to say that Ka just means someone's soul essentially isn't quite the full, it doesn't quite encapsulate everything that Ka is. It goes into the body of whatever person is connected to this door, and it is not someone he chooses. And so the first person whose body he shares is a heroin addict named Eddie Dean, and he currently is on a plane transporting drugs. And so this section goes on for quite some time, and we have Roland in Eddie's body getting food from Eddie's world and bringing it back to his world so that he can feed his sick and dying body. But then also he helps Eddie put the drugs into Roland's world so that Eddie can go through customs and everything and not get caught. But there is a lot of stuff going on with this Eddie section, a lot of drama and a lot of funny moments as well, but also a lot of tense moments. And ultimately we end up with Eddie butt naked in a gunfight with the guys whose drugs he was carrying. And long story short, Eddie's brother was killed, his brother who was also a heroin addict. So these drug dealers had killed his brother, and then they end up killing some of them, and they are able to grab some penicillin, which the drug dealer had. And Eddie brings that and Roland back into Roland's world. Roland goes back into his own body, and they give him the penicillin in order to cure him from the infection he has. And then also they don't have any food to eat, but Eddie is the one who gets the idea to kill the lobstrosities and eat the lobster meat. And also, so Roland, he is like so sick. He was on the brink of death. So he's taking the medicine, but he's so out of it. But also Eddie had a rough go of it the first number of days because he was going through heroin withdrawal. So they were both pretty sick. But ultimately, each of them start to improve when they then come upon the second door. And these are not side by side. Like they have to walk along the beach for days before finding the next door. And so in this second door, we have Odetta, the character who is referred to as being schizophrenic. So she has an alternate personality whose name is Detta. And while Odetta is a kind, upstanding citizen who is wealthy and is part of the civil rights movement, this is in 1964, by the way, Detta, on the other hand, is an evil, conniving woman. And whenever Detta takes over, she's always trying to sabotage and ruin Odetta's life in one way or another. But Detta doesn't acknowledge that Odetta exists. And when Detta takes over, sorry, I hope the names aren't too confusing. Obviously, they're almost identical. But when Detta, the evil one, takes over, she will be in charge for like a number of days. And then when Odetta comes back, she doesn't know what happened. And she doesn't even know that this other personality exists. And so her brain will fill in the blanks on its own. And so she doesn't even know she has these blank spaces in time. I mean, she kind of does. Like her subconscious is aware that something weird is going on, but she doesn't consciously confront it. And also, the way she first got a split personality was when she was a child. Someone dropped a brick on her head and she was in a coma for a number of days. But then also later in her life, someone pushed her in front of the subway and that caused her to lose her legs. So she is also in a wheelchair. And when Roland goes through the door and enters Odetta's body, Detta is the one who is in control. And there's some stuff going on, but it's not nearly as much as what's happening with Eddie. And so ultimately, she just comes back into Roland's world pretty quickly. And as soon as they come through into the world, Odetta is the one who takes over. And over time, basically, Eddie falls in love with Odetta as he talks to her. And they fall in love kind of fast, especially Eddie falls in love with her very fast. But I guess it's understandable considering he's been thrust into this very strange situation. He is scared and vulnerable, and so he finally meets someone from his world who was brought here, and she just happens to be a beautiful woman, and so of course I guess it's not too crazy that he ends up falling in love with her. However, pretty soon Detta then takes over, and for the next few days, she just makes life a living hell for Roland and Eddie. And Roland is getting progressively sicker and sicker because he took penicillin. However, he didn't take it for the full length of time because they only had so much. So he is getting sicker, and they are walking along the beach trying to find the next door, and Odetta is just making it really hard. Plus, trying to push a wheelchair in the sand also is not easy. So once Detta takes over, it is very slow going for them. But eventually Odetta does return, and then Roland, he gets too sick to move, and so Eddie, the plan is for him and Odetta to keep going until they come across the third door. Then he is going to leave Odetta there, take her wheelchair, come back to Roland, and wheel Roland to the third door because he can no longer walk. And so this is what they end up doing. However, once they reach the third door, Eddie, he ends up giving Odetta a gun in order to protect herself. And so he and Roland ultimately end up coming back to the third door to find Odetta is gone, and they both know that Detta has taken over, and now she is hiding out somewhere with a gun. And so Eddie, he doesn't want to go through the third door. He wants to stay and try to find Odetta, whom he is now more in love with than ever, and the two even consummated their love when Roland was left behind. But Roland, he does go through the door, and he inhabits the body of Jack Mort, a guy who, surprise, surprise, is the very person who dropped a brick on Odetta's head, which is what caused her to split into these two personalities. Not only that, he is also the same man who years later pushed her in front of the subway and caused her to lose her legs. And so I did like how all of this is interconnected. And so again, that's why she is not a schizophrenic at all, but even her dissociative identity disorder, I'm not an expert, but I wouldn't say it's written in a way that's medically accurate, but at the same time, like, it's okay because it's almost like part of a supernatural thing. But then also I know people don't like when disorders like this are given like, oh, it's all magical and supernatural, or, whatever, because that it's like othering people who have these things, right? And the misrepresentation. But ultimately, I did kind of like that things in Odetta's life, these key moments, are tied to the tower and the doors in these other worlds. So I did think that was a nice touch. But then also another thing this guy did, he is the one who pushes Jake into the street, which leads him to die and therefore show up in Roland's world in the first book. And at first, when he sees Jake, I was like, oh man, he is going to bring Jake back into his world. They will be reunited. This is awesome. I'm excited. But ultimately, that is not what happens. He saves Jake from being pushed by Jack. However, Jake doesn't then come with them. But yeah, he stops something that was meant to happen from happening. So I'm sure there will be repercussions from that. So anyway, while in Jack Mort's body, he gets some shotgun shells, which they are in dire need of because a lot of their bullets were ruined from the ocean waves. And so he gets a ton of those. He also gets more penicillin. And again, a lot of this was pretty funny, the way it was written, the way he interacts with our world, and, also sticking up a pharmacy in such a drastic way just to get a bunch of penicillin is kind of funny. And it was also just very exciting too. So very well written all the way around. But ultimately, when Roland eventually goes back to his world with his supplies, he is in the body of Jack Mort. And this time, rather than bringing Jack Mort with him, the way it happens is Jack Mort ends up dying in this transition, which good riddance, right? Because this guy sucked. Also, Mort, that means death in French, which is very fitting. I took French 1 and French 2 in college, although I have forgotten a lot of it, but I remember Mort. But meanwhile, while Roland had been in our world, Detta had gotten Eddie and she had tied him up and he was being attacked by the lobstrosities. But when Roland goes back through the door, Detta looks at the doorway and this causes her to see her other self. And so they essentially end up splitting into two distinct people, and Detta tries to kill Odetta, but then Odetta overpowers Detta with love and is like hugging her. And so Odetta's love overpowers Detta, and they become a third new person who is now called Susanna. And they end up saving Eddie, and the book then ends with Roland taking his medicine and getting better, and Eddie and Susanna being all good, and they come upon plants and are able to switch up their diet because living on just lobster meat was giving them a lot of health issues. And we end with them continuing their way to the tower. And Roland, he has softened up to some extent, and yet like he admires Eddie and Susanna, and he has seen both of them change a lot over the course of their journey. Susanna has like literally changed. But Eddie too, he was, this punk heroin junkie. And so the way he's grown over the course of the story, Roland is impressed by both of them. And they both have this strong bond and love for each other, meaning Eddie and Susanna. But Roland also knows, like, ultimately, he will be willing to let them die. He knows that they are probably going to have to sacrifice their lives in order for him to reach the tower, much like Jake's life had to be sacrificed. And there are a couple things I want to mention before I close out, which we do get another quote about the tower, because it's like, why does he want the tower? Sometimes I almost forget what the point of the tower is because there's just so many other things going on. But in the book we read, "Far from the beach where you found me," he's asking where the tower is. And he says, "Far from the beach where you found me, how far I know not." What is it? I don't know that either, except for that it may be a kind of a bolt, a central linchpin that holds all of existence together, all existence, all time, and all size. And I also like this quote, which Eddie, he is saying this to Roland. "There are people who need people to need them. The reason you don't understand is because you're not one of those people. You'd use me and then toss me away like a paper bag if that's what it came down to. God effed you, my friend. You're just smart enough so it would hurt you to do that, but just hard enough so you'd go ahead and do it anyway. You wouldn't be able to help yourself. If I was lying on the beach there and screaming for help, you'd walk over me if I was between you and your tower. Isn't that pretty close to the truth?" And then this other quote I want to share. "Odetta hugged him and wept, and Eddie held her and rocked her, and Roland thought, Eddie will be all right now. His brother is dead, but he has someone else to take care of, so Eddie will be all right now. But he felt a pang, a deep reproachful hurt in his heart. He watched the two of them, watched Eddie hug her, assure her it was going to be all right. He could not have done that, and now the rue in his heart was joined by stealthy fear. If you have given up your heart for the tower, Roland, you have already lost. A heartless creature is a loveless creature, and a loveless creature is a beast. To be a beast is perhaps bearable, although the man who has become one will surely pay hell's own price in the end. But what if you should gain your object? What if you should, heartless, actually storm the dark tower and win it? If there is naught but darkness in your heart, what could you do except degenerate from beast to monster? To gain one's object as a beast would only be bitterly comic, like giving a magnifying glass to an elephant. But to gain one's object as a monster? To pay hell is one thing, but do you want to own it?" He thought of Allie and of the girl who had once waited for him at the window, thought of the tears he had shed over Cuthbert's lifeless corpse. Oh, then he had loved. Yes, then I do want to love, he cried. But although Eddie was also crying a little now with the woman in the wheelchair, the gunslinger's eyes remained as dry as the desert he had crossed to reach this sunless sea. And then in the 1964 timeline, we get a quote about JFK and how he was referred to as a gunslinger, which is a real thing. And of course, Stephen King was a fan of JFK, 11/22/63, which I do plan to cover this year. So stay tuned. I've read it before. I've just never watched the show in its entirety. But obviously, I think anyone who was old enough to remember the assassination, just that right there, the fact that he was killed, makes them revere him, but also as a person, right? Anyway, the quote reads, "America has seen the passage of the world's last gunslinger. That rang deeply in her mind. It was ugly, it was untrue. John Kennedy had been a peacemaker, not a leather-slapping Billy the Kid type. That was more in the Goldwater line, but it had also, for some reason, given her goosebumps." And yeah, I guess that basically wraps it up on my thoughts on the drawing of the three. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts. Again, I really liked this book. I'm looking forward to reading the third one now. That video, April is kind of a busy month because there are 2 TV shows I want to cover on top of my other videos. So I don't know if I'll get to the third book in April, but definitely sometime in May. My video for the third book will be up. I wanted to finish this series by the end of the year, but I'm going about it slower than I had anticipated. So we'll see when I end up wrapping it up. But yeah, anyway, thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on the drawing of the 3 down below. What was your favorite part? Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.